Okay, we're looking now at the best midfielder currently in Gaelic football, and we were just as we were teeing up talking about this conversation, we came to Galway, and they've a load of really good midfielders. Over the years we've seen Tom Flynn play there, Fenton Corrine, even Peter Cook looks a really stylish footballer. But there's probably nobody who'd absolutely hammer you over the head and say, I'm one of the top midfielders or possibly the best midfielder in Ireland, even though it might happen yet because obviously they're on that upward trajectory in the first year under Pádraig Joyce. But I think for the moment, you can't really have anyone from Galway in here.
Not in the best of the best conversation as regard midfielders. I thought Tom Flynn was good in recent years. Remember, their tactic was to isolate him on a sideline. That was their go-to tactic from kick out, particularly when they were in trouble. And teams started twigging that and just started flooding that area. Like when they played Dublin, Dublin would just make sure they'd have loads of bodies over there and be able to break the ball away from them. Is it Jason Steed with Corofin?
Ronan Steed. Now he looks really good, and
Steed.
he was club player of the year. Then you've Keane Darcy who's been in there, Paul Conroy who's been in there. So you actually have an unbelievable wealth of lads who could play midfield. And Ronan Steed would probably have had more game time with the tribe in the last couple of seasons if he wasn't he wasn't missing out on the league or most of the league because he was with Corofin. So he's probably the most likely to be up at the very top of that conversation. But the rest, there's like a huge amount of good midfielders or potentially very good midfielders, but not actually really kind of grabbing my attention for this.
Basically, I'm just thinking, you have Eamon Dunphy's voice on. It's like there's a lot of good players, but not many great players.
Right, who is definitely up at the top? Asher, look, we might as well just say it. Brian Fenton is up at the very top of this, and it's going to be hard for anyone to really nudge in on that. But the funny one that you could bring in there is a player that, even though he wouldn't be considered at the top end of this, Jack Barry has done well to shut him down at times.
Yeah, 100%. Brian Fenton was kept very, very quiet, and one of the main reasons why the drive for five was nearly steamrolled by Kerry was because Jack Barry came in from the cold, having been injured for a lot of the summer, and totally subdued Brian Fenton. We're going to do a separate video about best man markers, and it's funny almost to talk about a midfielder as a man marker, but that's what he can do, and I suppose it's a sign of what Brian Fenton can do that a team would do that. I remember playing wing back one time for Borough in a football match, and I was being man marked because I used to just run forward the whole time and try to get points. That's what I used to do. We played a semi-final and it was man marked, and I couldn't believe it. And I'd say Brian Fenton was nearly like that last year in the All-Ireland final. Maybe he wasn't expecting it, and I don't know, was he sick or something? Something was off anyway in the first day, and he was poor. Jack Barry got the better of him. And the second day, he had a bit more of an influence on the game. But it's funny, Jack Barry, in a way, has to be in the conversation as a result of that as well. Maybe some injuries and a few things have meant that he hasn't been consistently dominating for Kerry at midfield, but he's dominated Brian Fenton a couple of times. Back in that league final in 2017 when they stopped the unbeaten streak, that was a lot to do with Jack Barry. And they nearly stopped the drive for five, and that was a lot to do with him as well. But that'll just show, it just tells you how good Brian Fenton is. Brian Fenton, my colleague Martin Breheny did best 20 Dublin footballers in the last 50 years. He had Brian Fenton at number 4, having played for Dublin for 5 years. He lost no championship games. I asked him, I said, hypothetically, if Dublin win 3 out of the next 5 All-Irelands, and Brian Fenton has a similar 5 years as he had for the previous 5, he says, where does he go? He said, to be honest, I think he goes number 1. And that's probably ahead of Stephen Cluxton. And that's just the impact that he's had. He is the Rolls-Royce midfielder. Again, we talked about Brian Howard as a half forward and kind of maybe a modern day half forward. Brian Fenton is your modern day midfielder. Can catch, but he's not 15 stone and can't move. Can catch, can glide across the ground, can score, can get back and tackle, has everything you'd want in a midfielder, really.
He's basically Liam McHale of that Mayo era, except these lads are dominating, and every single season he's looking like he's probably going to be in the Footballer of the Year conversation or not far off it. Aiden O'Shea then, the man who's won 3 All-Stars, 1 midfield, 1 centre forward, 1 full forward, attracts a huge amount of criticism. He is a lightning rod for criticism every time Mayo lose. And obviously one of his best performances in the last couple of years came at full back, which kind of, even though he played really well, kind of adds, it's like an extra stick to beat him with. Somehow or other, people love hammering him. Where do you have him in this conversation?
I think he's high up in the conversation. I do not understand why he's bashed. I don't know if is it because he has like an unusual haircut, or it's like he's a modern day kind of he has the kind of a quiff, and he just seems to, and because he's so big, he seems to attract the criticism. Like, just take out some of the Dublin games, right? And for 60 minutes in the 17 final, he was doing brilliant, and he just faded, and James McCarthy got into the game, and Dublin just got over the line. Take out some of the Dublin games, and like you're saying, people say, oh, he struggles against Dublin. Okay, he dominates against 90% of other teams. So, like, I know that Dublin is the barometer, but like, a lot of players struggle against Dublin. There's not many. It's very, very hard for a lad to deliver, sevens and eights out of 10 every day against Dublin. So yeah, they obviously target him, and they try to maybe expose maybe what they perceive as a lack of mobility. But I just think it's such an easy thing just to say, oh, another big game, Aiden O'Shea didn't show up. And I think it's bollocks, to be honest with you. I think he's, for the guts of the last decade, I think he's been absolutely outstanding for them. There's been a couple of big games. It's not as if he's been like torn apart or anything like that. Far from it. Far from it. I think he's had a brilliant career. As you said, mixing between 3, 11, 14, and now midfield predominantly.
Yeah, like, what about going at this constructively? Like, and you've mentioned the positions he's played. I remember him starting off in 2009, I think it was. He was in full forward, himself and Barry Moore, and their answer to Kerry's twin towers of Donaghy and Tommy Walsh. Is it possible that in another era he would have been one of these unstoppable players, because he's absolutely huge, he's able to move, and he's actually a very good footballer technically, but because of the size and obviously that James McCarthy performance, especially in the last 10 minutes in that All-Ireland a few years ago, that his size profile isn't suited to playing against a team of absolute lean butcher's dogs that are that Dublin football team, that any other era he would have been collecting Footballer of the Year titles. But it just so happens at the sharp end of things against Dublin, he's just a little bit of fish out of water. He's still a brilliant player, but somehow it just doesn't quite work against them. And when he's been thrown in full forward and moved around from different positions, because they know there's a brilliant footballer there, but they're trying to find the right spot to get the most out of him. And you put him in full forward, and that kind of makes him just kind of a standing target almost. Somehow or other, it's just the wrong man in the wrong era, the right man but the slightly wrong era, even though he's still done a huge amount.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Imagine, like, if you were to go back through any of the eras, the 70s, 80s, 90s, noughties, he would have dominated. He would have absolutely lorded it. And he has lorded it to a certain degree. But when you play the best of the best, the Dubs is all about mobility. And like Aiden O'Shea has worked phenomenally hard to get himself as mobile as he is. I'd say it's something that he's conscious of the whole time, and even working on his feet and making sure that he's not caught for a turn or anything like that. Like, he's a big man. Like, if you compare him now to 2012 in the All Ireland final, like, it's a different man completely.
And within that, like, I saw him in the 2020 league clash in McHale Park against Dublin, and he was actually more or less Mayo's most impressive player on the field, especially at the start of the game. Because, when he gets the ball in his hands and he goes at you, he is going to pretty much burst his way through you. He also had some great turnovers too. So the potential is there to do it, but for whatever reason, and I think this is more down to the collective of Mayo than necessarily him, and of course, I don't think it helped either, that article from basically a guy who'd been working inside the camp and talked about not working enough on the left foot, and then obviously you had the fallout from Holmes and Kennelly and people slating that the O'Sheas picked the panel and all this kind of stuff. I think the stuff that comes out of Mayo in terms of slating their players, or that ends up slating their players or shining the spotlight on them, makes it harder for players there than pretty much any other county. It would have been the thing that kind of, all the hype and all that would have hurt Dublin a lot maybe a decade ago, and slightly even before that. But I think it's as bad, if not way worse, for Mayo now.
Yeah, no, it's not great. And he just seems to be the one, to be honest with you, I can't really think of many others. Him and his club teammate Rob Henley are the two that get it worse, really, down through the years. But O'Shea just seems to be, I don't know if there's criticism to be thrown out. I remember so a journalist saying to me one time, he said to me that he was at one of the Mayo County finals, and he said, briefly we're playing, and he said that O'Shea didn't try. And I was looking at him, and I think I walked away. I was like, that's the sort of stuff that he seems to get thrown at, man. It's absolutely ridiculous. Think he's a brilliant footballer. He 20 to 30 possessions per game. 20, like, he's their kind of link man at midfield as well. He's not going to be my number one, but he's definitely deserves to be in the conversation without a doubt.
We'll cycle through a few other names. Niall Kearns and Darren Hughes with Monaghan, really good players. Gary Brennan's an interesting one. He had opted out for 2020 to go travelling, but I would imagine anyone who was looking to travel for the year, that's very much up in the air at the moment, because who knows what's going to happen. Airlines, who knows about restrictions in different countries. So Gary Brennan's back in the mix. I'll just run through a couple more.
Just on that as well, I'm not going to like try and get inside anyone's mind or say what they were doing, but there could have been some lads like early, just gone 30 or early 30s that were gonna not play football this year, and maybe, you know, drift away and retire. But it's a different kind of scenario. It's a different kind of scenario now. If the championship goes ahead, we'll say this year, or eventually goes ahead, it's going to be different. If it had went ahead as normal and Clare played, we'll just say, and Gary Brennan retired, like, it's okay, things go ahead. But now you're almost like waiting for him to come back, because the reason why he was taking the year out is no longer possible. So it'd just be interesting to see if certain fellas, it might just change what their thinking was, him being one of them. Just on Niall Kearns as well. Niall Kearns obviously had that kind of heart defect and missed it. I think he basically had open heart surgery and missed an awful lot of time. But just a couple of league games, even I saw him this year, looks to be totally back to his best. Was brilliant a couple of years ago, and he takes a lot of pressure off the Hugheses as well. So for them to compete, they need someone like that. He was back to his best as well, so he's definitely comes into the mix. I've big time for him now, I have to say.
I'll go through a few honourable mentions. I think Ian Maguire, I think Brian Fenton, John O'Loughlin, Darren Gallagher with Longford, Kevin Feely's definitely up there, I think, in the conversation. Donegal have a bit like Galway, a lot of good midfielders, but I'm not sure who would be the most standout of the lot. Brendan and Sean Murphy in Carlow, even though Brendan Murphy, funnily enough, like their main man, he goes away for the one season where they really do make a few headlines. And Jarlath O'Byrne, he's a guy now that I think could become very dominant as the years go by.
Yeah, he's got the breeding anyway, hasn't he? Like, he was nominated for Young Footballer of the Year last year. He's a brilliant talent. I've never seen, was it a score he got or a catch he made in a Sigerson Cup match? It was absolutely outrageous. He's all the raw athleticism of, again, a modern type midfielder. I think John O'Loughlin from Laois is someone that would have to come into this equation as well. He's been playing for Laois for over a decade now, and he's just been rock solid throughout. I remember I caught the tail end of Laois and Offaly last year. I nipped over from a game in Newbridge to watch it was the round 3 qualifier game, and Offaly just couldn't get past him midfield, could not win a kick out. He was so dominant. And again, he's probably one of these lads. There's a lot of lads that will dominate to a certain level, and then they play the doves maybe and they don't dominate, and people are like, oh, he's not as good as you think. It's like when Gary Brennan was playing brilliant stuff for Clare and ended up playing Kerry in the All-Ireland quarter-final, and Kerry can put all their attention into stopping Gary Brennan, do you know what I mean, and stifle him, whereas, like, you know, it's a difficult task for some of these lads when they're playing against the best of the best, and they're one of their best players. But I think when push comes to shove, I'd say we're going to come back to the same man. I think we have to.
Well, and David Moore, and who I think we've somehow failed to mention, even though he's written down here on my notes. I hope I mentioned Ian Maguire being a good midfielder as well. So David Moore or Brian Fenton, it's basically between those two, isn't it?
I couldn't be looking beyond Fenton, because if you're saying, I'm not saying David Moran's not mobile, but he's not as mobile as Brian Fenton is. He's not able to cover that ground like Brian Fenton can. Brian Fenton can basically cover, that 100 metres. I'd love to see what he'd be able to do 100 metres in. I'd say he wouldn't be too far behind Jack McCaffrey. And again, he has that elusiveness in front of the post. You just see him when he gets the ball, maybe 65 yards out, and if there's a bit of space, you just think, oh, he's going to score here. Was it against Kerry? Yeah, it's against Kerry in the league this year when Jack Barry wasn't playing. I think he kicked 4 from play. I think Aiden O'Shea was out around him at different stages. I don't know if he was on him, but that's what he can do. That's what he can do when he's not. He doesn't get that specialist attention. David Moran's a brilliant midfielder. Again, a fielder. A brilliant fielder. But for mobility, it's Brian Fenton for me, and just Like, I don't know how you can go against a lad that has played 5 years for his county and hasn't lost a championship game yet.
I won't have the cheek to even try. But if anyone out there, please comment in, let us know if we're right, wrong, indifferent. You mightn't agree, so let us know.